Welcome to the Center for Christianity, Culture, and the Arts Conference, the Digitization of Christian Imagination. My name is Dane Sanders. You're going to see me a few times today, and I'll explain more about that in just a second. But first of all, just welcome. It's a really exciting deal to have you all here on a beautiful Saturday morning to talk about an idea that I think is important to get after. And our intent today, just up front so you understand, is not just to talk at you, but to talk with you. There's a lot of highly interactive pieces to our conversation. You'll get to know a lot of different voices, and it'll be rapid. And the reason we're starting right on time is because we need to make sure that, because everything is so time-based, that we make sure we get through everyone. Also, there's going to be plenty of time to dialogue with the speakers, as well as have a chance to dig in a little more personally to how these ideas might impact you. So my invitation is whether or not if you're tweeting, you can use the hashtag CCCA CONF, as in CCCA CONF. If you use those, we can be in tune with what you're thinking about or kind of ideas that are interesting to you. But at the breaks for coffee, as well as the lunchtime hour and then the breakout sessions in the afternoon, we really hope you take advantage of our time. So my job this morning, just to get started, it might be helpful to just give a quick little backdrop on me. I work here at the university. I have a chance to help secure the future of things like the CCCA, as well as Biola's Center for Christian Thought and the Center for Marriage and Relationships. And these are just basically outward-focused efforts on behalf of the institution to really make a contribution to the world. That Biola could have a unique offering that maybe historically we've done more just for our own internal community, and now we're very interested in looking externally and saying what unique things do we have that could serve God through the world. And distinct from that role here on campus, I actually have a life before that. And that life for the last, decade and a half or so is actually connected to the arts. I'm a photographer by trade, and before all of that began, I was a teacher at a little college up in Santa Barbara called Westmont. Some of you guys know of it. We don't like them this week. They beat us in a nail biter the other day in basketball. But when I was at Westmont, I ran into a student, actually, and I think this is maybe a microcosm of some of what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. But I ran into this student who didn't know very much, although he was very talented. And in his talent, and because he was getting access to this new digital world that was opening up to him, he was just about to drop out of college. And while he was about to drop out, he took my leadership and character development class and started enrolling me in the idea of this new technology, these crazy things, could actually give access to even you middle-aged man, to this idea of creativity and image making. And I decided to get into that world a little bit. Because I was on faculty, I had the opportunity to take courses for free. So I took my first Photoshop class and my first photography class, like many of you students. And as I kind of waded my way in, I realized how accessible everything had become in a moment. And photography in particular, and you guys all get this, because if you have something in your pocket that used to be a telephone, you're a photographer too. You carry a camera everywhere you go. And of course, that in the early days, this was very exciting to see things begin to kind of open up. Well, that led to me ruining my academic career. I ended up becoming a full-time photographer, left Westmont College. I ended up writing a handful of books, kind of stealing my leadership stuff into the photo conversation. My faith, it turns out, actually had a significant import into that kind of career move, and I'll share more about that in a minute. But long story short, here I found myself as an unlikely suspect in a world of creativity and commerce, because it was not only making things, but also making money from those things I was making. And it struck me as incredibly odd. When I found myself in that place, I ran into a lot of cultural shifting that was going on, and that's going to be another core topic of the day as we get into it. But I think that when I reflect back on that season in particular, I just realize now that we were in the midst of a tectonic shift Barry, you're pointing at something and I'm not sure what it is. The time I see it? Okay, thank you so much. By the way, Barry Kramer's in the back. He's our director for the Center for Christianity, Culture, and the Arts. Can we just acknowledge Barry really quickly for all of his hard work that he's done to create this event? So I want to tell a very quick story that connects to, I don't know, for me it's endemic. It's a microcosm of our world. And it comes from a website. Some of you guys know what this website is. It's called Reddit. It's basically a place where people can ask questions, any question, and any of us could log on anytime and give our best response to these questions. And a year or two ago, there was a question that came up that said something like this. What would be the hardest thing to explain to someone who transported from, say, the 1950s to today? If they just showed up out of the blue and we had to explain one aspect of our current culture, what would be the hardest thing to explain? And of course, there were several answers that were very entertaining and fun to read, but my favorite, by a mile, went something like this. I hold in my hand, actually in my pocket, and everyone in this room, I suspect, has one of these in their pockets, this magical device, this brick. And within this brick, you can have access to all of the world's knowledge over the history of all of time. And we use it to look at cat videos and argue with people. There's this incredible phenomenon of our perspective on these technologies, this digital reality that we're in the middle of. And when I read that, I found it far funnier than you all did. It struck me as amazing that we live in this phenomenal moment, and yet in the midst of this phenomenal moment, we're not necessarily using it the best we could, especially as Christians. So as we get into the conversation and to kick the conversation off, and again, my job is to really just kind of set the tone on a handful of topics like we're going to kind of tease out throughout the day as you're going to hear from various folks. But I want to play 3 one-minute clips. And these clips are trailers to a movie called Press, Pause, Play, which was in large form an inspiration for what we were kind of wrapping this conference around. And as I play them, my invitation for you is to simply put yourself in the position of noticing. Asking yourself the question, what is going on for me as I watch this? How do I think about this world that we live in? And it'll be self-explanatory and we'll talk about it. So here's the first clip. Hope and digital culture. When you saw that clip, did you find yourself saying, this is good news or this is bad news? I'm sorry, I'm an insecure man, and if I don't hear back from you, I really think I'm talking to myself. When you saw that clip, did you hear something that was good news or bad news? Both, good news, bad news, interesting, great. So now what I'm gonna do right away, we're not gonna talk about it too much, we're gonna get to it again, but I'm gonna play a second clip, okay? Same movie, different trailer. And I want you to notice how you relate it. By the way, this isn't a trick question, this is just an honest question. How are you experiencing this phenomenon of digital culture, the age that we're living in, and how are you relating with it? What is your perspective on it? And as you watch this clip, I'm wondering if anything might change. Good. Well, okay, let's actually do a survey, and I'm going to invite you to actually commit, okay? So unless it's precisely 50-50, after the first clip, how many people said bad news, bad news? How many people said bad news? Nice, like commit, go all in, like right here, excellent. And how many people, after the first clip, said good news? Okay, great. And now in the second clip, how many people said bad news? Actually some shifting, interesting. And then how many people said good news? No question, a lot more. Okay, great. By the way, this is not a leading question. I'm not trying to get a particular response. But I'm going to play one last clip, one more version, same movie, different perspective. And I want to see what you think now. Bad news. One guy. Good news. A few more people. Now, this is fascinating to me. Anybody feeling a little bit of the tension? Because of course we all have this sense of like, well, it depends, right? It depends. If it could be good news, it could be bad news. But I don't know about you, but that last one, every time I hear that clip and I hear the chord progression, it's kind of grabbing me in my chest and I'm kind of thumping with the music. And then all of a sudden, Moby just kind of pops the balloon and says, we're scared. And what I want to suggest, this is a much broader conversation than creativity and commerce, which is what a lot of this is focusing on, because we want to expand that conversation to include scholarship and a consideration of really the Christian perspective on this is of any implication on Christians in particular. But my invitation for you, especially if you are an artist, if you find yourself as a creative person, whether professionally or just as an enthusiast, my invitation for you is to stay in the tension of this question. The moral question of is it good or bad is kind of one angle on it, but another is where is the opportunity? The roots of our institution here at Biola University are that we're evangelicals. We like sharing good news. And if there is some good news in this, especially in the culture that we find ourselves in, my invitation for you is to engage that seriously, to talk out loud with it, to work it out, and to live in the tension throughout the day. I have a friend who's not here today, who is an artist. His name is Jeremy Cowart, and he is a photographer down in Nashville. He's actually a common friend to one of our speakers today. And he asked the question, which is more important in the age that we live in? To be seen or learning how to see? And in particular, he's asking the question in a sea of social media, and in a sea of, hey, look at what I'm doing, and in a sea of the ability to distribute content rapidly and without barriers. And it seems like a never-ending desire for people to notice either our work or ourselves. That seems to be a draw. And yet, it also seems like there could be some great opportunity to maybe press pause on that part of the conversation and really ask the question on the artistic side, what does it mean to learn how to see? And when we look at it from the Christian perspective in particular, one question that I want to kind of keep coming back to throughout the day is this notion of, are we Christians first or are we artists first? There's some really bad Christian art out there. Really bad. And this was actually I did a Google search of images and just said, bad Christian art, and this is what I got. And my favorite one is actually it's really offensive, but in the top near the right where the bodybuilder is flexing on the cross, there's something about that. And then on the left, the handoff to Jesus to score the touchdown is very exciting. And then Jesus with the gun, of course, that's always a favorite, and the tattoo. And you can't really get away without showing Thomas Kincaid at least once in one of these presentations. And what was great was this is just a quick little smattering. It just kind of popped up. And without picking on anyone in particular, because I'm sure there were some well-intentioned folks who made these things, I want to ask the question, what is it about our culture that we live in this moment that could inform how we ought to position ourselves as faithful followers of Jesus, who happen to also aspire to make creations that move people? Again, just as a quick note before I'm complete, this is a very personal question for me. This is a picture of my first book that I wrote. It's called Fast Track Photographer. It is not called Get Quick, Rich Quickly Photographer. In fact, it's not even a photography book at all. It was a book about identity, who you are as a creative, that I smuggled into a book that had the word fast track on it and the word photographer on it in the hopes that people would buy it. And it turned out I'm, again, a very unlikely person to have written anything and have it published in this field. What happened was I had this background in leadership and character development. I pick up a camera, I start to learn how to be competent with it and really start enjoying that guild and craft and art. And in the middle of it, I had this idea about a book, and I started writing it, and I thought, how would a Christian write a book to photographers? Would it really be about technical aspects of making like f-stops and shutter speeds and making images, or could it be something more? So I ended up writing a book not so much about the photography, but about the person who's taking the images, about the photographer. And in the course of that effort, I self-published a book. So because we live in digital culture, I was able to write a manuscript, do all the things that a major publishing house would do. I hired an editor, I had a graphic designer for my cover, typesetting, sent my little stuff into the Library of Congress, so it was all official, got it all done, throw it on Amazon, and I sell a bunch of copies. Then about 4 or 5 months later, I get a phone call from the acquisitions editor at Random House, and about 2 months later, it worked out to be a 2-book deal with Random House. What's great about having a book deal from Random House is it's very easy to get a book agent when you already have a deal, because they're getting paid instantly. So very kind of backwards like, I found myself in this position where I was now publishing multiple books with a major publishing house, getting significant support, a healthy advance, and I was in shock. Like, I shouldn't be that guy. But what was amazing was, if it wasn't for the culture that we're in, where I was trying to smuggle conversations about identity to a very tiny little niche market of photographers, in this age that we're in, those ideas never would have made it to print. But because of the age that we live in, that actually was not only possible, but it actually happened. So for me, this seems like a tremendously opportune moment, but I don't want to be naive to the pitfalls in front of us. I guess in one kind of nutshell, I would love it if, as we engage the rest of our speakers today and the workshops that we're in, the invitation I want to invite you to is to stretch your perspective. And to help with that, I want to share 2 little images. Again, I'm a photographer, so I can show these. This image is of my father. He's the guy in the pajamas. And my brother David is on your left, and then my brother Derek is in the middle. And my father is staring at his favorite son, who's naked. That's me. And this is a wonderful picture. It's a very meaningful picture for me. It was the only picture ever taken of my father and I in the same frame. A week or so later after this, he tragically died in a car accident. And not only did I grow up without a dad, I was about 3 years old, my dad's dad, it turns out, also died when my dad was 3. So you might imagine I have a perspective on a legacy of dad. I have 4 children, by the way. They're all like 9 or above, so I'm in the clear. I'm good news. But the reason I wanted to share that is you could imagine I had a perspective. I was kind of locked in on a way the world is based on that experience. Well, not too long ago, a gentleman I mentioned earlier, Jeremy Cowart, was gracious enough to come to my house, and we made this picture together. And all of a sudden, I had a chance to shift my perspective. I got the fancy pants pajamas. I do love my daughter, Allery. She's not my favorite, although today she is. I think I like her more today. But what I discovered in the process of just taking on a new vantage point was that as I went back and forth, I began to notice common things, like my daughter, who I didn't think I looked anything like. All of a sudden, I was like, oh, wow, there's commonality here. There's also new opportunities. There's hope, not just fear. So as we finish this presentation and move on to the next, my invitation is for you to engage the conversation, to stretch your own perspective, to talk out loud about what that might be, to assert it, to play with it. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll have made a couple steps in some really constructive directions. The hashtag for today is CCCA conference. I'm at Dane Sanders on the Twitter. I would love to say hello. And before we move any further, I just want to give a quick introduction. And for the sake of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the next 3 speakers right now. I'm going to vacate stage, and they're just going to come in succession, and then you guys can get to know them. So how does that sound? How does that sound? Thank you very much. Our speakers, I'm at an age, by the way, where glasses do this a lot, so forgive me. Our first speaker is Joshua Clayton. Joshua is a New York-based artist. His new media-oriented practice shifts between material artifacts and ephemeral situations, digital and analog media. His interests range from semiotics to landscape, Cartesian space, and environmental phenomena. And he currently teaches at NYU. So you'll hear from Joshua first, followed by Karen Swallow-Prior. Karen is a professor of English at Liberty Baptist University in Lynchburg, Virginia. Her books include Fierce Conversations, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, and Booked, Literature in the Soul of Me. She is contributing writer for Christianity Today, The Atlantic, In Touch, and Think Christian. And her writing has also appeared in Comment, Relevant, Books and Culture, Field Notes, and The Well and Salvo. And then finally, we'll hear from Stephen Proctor. Stephen is a visual worship leader from Nashville. And he uses video projections as instruments of worship, and you'll get to experience some of that in a moment. He continues the tradition of illuminated manuscripts through cutting-edge technology and production as he floods churches with light and movement, creating spaces for full sensory worship. Proctor also creates visuals for indie bands across the country. So we're in for a treat. There's a lot of good stuff today. I hope you really enjoy it, but without further ado, let's welcome Joshua Clayton.
All right, thank you so much for having me today. It's really good to be here. I just arrived yesterday, and you definitely have New York beat in terms of weather right now. This is a great morning too, isn't it? It's just good to be here, and it's good to be outside too, so let's go out afterwards maybe as well. So here's what I want to talk to you about over the next about 20 minutes or so. This idea of the expressive potential of computational media. And if you are intrigued by this and you want to dialogue a little bit more interpersonally afterwards, Jonathan Anderson and I are going to also conduct a workshop of the same name later on. So please feel free to join us if you are so inclined. So this is an interesting way to start, right? Because when we're talking about computational media and its expressive potential, there's a little bit of irony in this concept, specifically because of the fact that digital media is not fundamentally conducive to nuance. All right? So this is one of the things that I'll often tell my students when they're first learning how to program, which is that when we're talking about programming language, it's literally on the other side of the spectrum from poetry, right? So you might place the very expressive, metaphorical approach to speaking and to communication on the end of poetry, and then right in the middle, somewhere along the lines of what I'm speaking to you right now, is kind of like prose, and then on the far end of that spectrum, you have programming, which is very precise, very literal, and not necessarily always conducive to nuance. But this is what we mean when we talk about the digital. It literally comes from digits, right? One. And specifically the 1 and the 0, right? You guys probably know this maybe from like high school, but the 1 or the 0 is a bit, and this is the fundamental unit of digital media. And I want to trace a bit of a narrative arc as I talk about digital media and its expressive potential, starting at a train station in the middle of Japan. In 2003, I was on my way back to Tokyo after spending some time in Sendai. And I arrived at this train station in Fukushima, Japan. And there was something about this particular arrival. There was something about the way that light and the speed of the train and the people disembarking heightened my awareness of that moment. It made me sensitive to just being alive right then. I think in particular there was a combination of factors surrounding the ephemerality of that moment. The fact that I knew I would not be able to experience that in the same way again, or share it with other people in the way that I had experienced it in that moment. To give you a little bit more context, at that particular time, I had come to Japan some months earlier with a missions organization that first brought me to Southern California called Asian Access. I was working as an associate of Asian Access, specifically at that time on a DVD project that I had proposed to the organization because the one that they were using at the time was relatively outdated, and I figured I would be able to do something better for them. Now, I had never actually created a DVD in my life before, and so I was just kind of like, I think I can do this, right? And so I proposed this project to them, and for some reason they were willing to go along with it, and so I was in the midst of producing this project. And here's one just key point that I'll bring up to begin with before I go into several other key points during my talk, which is this: if there's one thing about digital media, if there's one thing that digital media asks of us, it's ongoing learning, right? This stuff is always changing. So we need to adopt a posture of being open to that change, learning from it, and moving with it. Why is that, right? Here's a graph to illustrate why that is. All right. Have you ever heard of Moore's Law before? Moore's Law was emerged from a paper written by the founder of Intel, Gordon Moore. in 1965. And in 1965, Gordon Moore predicted that the number of transistors that can be inexpensively placed on an integrated circuit board doubles every 2 years. Now that's just a technical way of saying that computer processor speed will double every 2 years, and it has continued since 1965 roughly on that same trajectory. This is why, for example, the phone, right, that you bought last week or last year maybe already starts to feel like, this is not the latest potential, or the computer, or whatever it might be. So I come back to my apartment in the Tokyo suburb of Kaskabe, and I'm thinking about how to translate this experience of arriving at this train station in a web-based context, right? Maybe it was something about being far from where I'm originally from and not being around people that I know as well that led me to want to explore the expressive potential of the web to somehow translate that experience that I had in the train station in a web-based context. So what I did was I created one of my first, I guess you would call it an internet art piece, called Fukushima Sequence. And I'll just show you that right now. So Fukushima Sequence basically took individual frames from that video and placed them all in a grid. And the idea is that I wanted to try to convey some of what it was to move through that space and never be able to experience that in its entirety again. So this particular piece works like this. You don't really see anything until you begin to hover over different elements on the page. And then as you do so, you only see them briefly. You can never see the image in its entirety. Nor can you fully control the way it's working, but there's something about this that, for me, was representative of what it was like entering into that station at that time. And I still consider this to be a foundational piece in my development as a new media artist. In fact, I even just recently, within the past couple months, rewrote the code for this piece, updating it in various ways to be more open on the web. So this was new territory for me. I really hadn't been exposed to the kind of things that I had started to think about until my time in Japan. And on Mondays, which was my day off at that time, I would go into different neighborhoods in Tokyo and go to galleries where this kind of work was being done. So for example, the NTT Intercommunication Center in Shinjuku was one of the kind of places that exhibited work by new media artists using various technologies in creative ways. And this piece in particular, which is not in Shinjuku, but actually at Yokohama Station, is one that was particularly meaningful to me. This is Toyo Ito, the architect's Tower of Winds, built in 1989. And what's really fascinating about this piece is that the design requirement was essentially to create a duct system so that air can be, for exhaust for air in the station below. And it looks fairly plain during the day, but what happens is at night, like the city itself, the structure is transformed. And essentially what it does is it uses both environmental data, air quality, and I believe sound levels to modulate the light that's going on inside of this piece. And so it took the rather quotidian task of creating a duct system and used digital media, especially in this early phase of digital media, to translate that relationship in an interesting way. And so I would say that the next key point that I really want to convey to you is that if anything from images to sound can be encoded digitally, if anything from images to sound to video can be encoded digitally, then we can mix these different elements together just like cadmium and yellow ochre, right? And so digital actually is a new form of material that we can work with. And this, for example, just to come back to the idea of the bit, this is a plus sign, right? 8 bits equals a byte. And so if you put this particular sequence of bits together, you get a plus sign. The problem is that we've accepted that, but we've accepted it through interfaces, right? Here is Photoshop 1.0, released for the Macintosh in 1990. And you know what? This is actually, it might look a little retro, but this is very similar to the interface that you see today, right? So I'm sure a lot of you have used Photoshop before, and so you'll recognize the hand tool and the lasso tool and different selection commands. So it's not actually changed that much. We're still using these tools that have been given to us to create. This stems from the idea that we need specific products to do interesting things. Have you guys been to the Apple site recently? This is a screenshot from last month, and I specifically want to point you to this statement. When you start with amazing products, you can do amazing things, right? And my friends, I reject this notion, and you should too, okay? Here we go. You can create amazing things, even if you don't have Apple products. Douglas Rushkoff, the media theorist, puts it like this in his book Program or Be Programmed. Computers and networks finally offer us the ability to write. And we do write on our websites and blogs and social networks, but the underlying capability of the computer era is actually programming, which almost none of us knows how to do. We simply use the programs that have been made for us and enter our text in the appropriate box on the screen. And so for me, the big challenge was, how can we explore the plasticity of digital media? And as this quote indicates, that requires a little bit of knowledge of code. So in 2005, I moved to New York, and I'm still there today. And before I even arrived there, I was interested in a particular program that NYU offers called the Interactive Telecommunications Program. It was founded by Red Burns in 1979. It's one of the oldest new media programs around. And Red was fascinated by the democratization of technology introduced by the Sony Portapak. She was a filmmaker, and she was really interested in how the increasingly low cost of the Portapak put the power of filmmaking into the hands of artists. And so technology and art have been around for a while. In fact, at AT&T Bell Labs back in the 70s, there was a rich history of collaboration between artists and scientists, right? The artists had the ideas, and the scientists had the technological know-how for actually putting these things together. But here's the other misnomer, is the idea that these two people have to be separate, right? That you have to have the scientist who's serious and analytical and the artist who's creative and, is open to abstract ideas. But those two people can be the same person, and this is not a new idea. In fact, one of the figures that's been an influence to me is this guy. Does anyone know who this is? Samuel Morse, all right? This is Samuel Morse, and most of you know Samuel Morse by his great invention of the telegraph. Probably less of you know the fact that he was a painter. And he was a painter who was teaching at NYU, too, just like me. Isn't that crazy? So Samuel Morse was one of the first painting professors at NYU, and this is his invention. The triumph of the telegraph is how it changed our relationship to communication and presence, right? This is not fundamentally about electronics. This is about changing our relationship to communication and presence. And it took a lot of hacking to accomplish this. And now, when I say hacking, maybe a lot of you have a sort of negative connotation about what hacking is, because we hear the word hacking a lot in news, like the bank was hacked, or your credit cards were hacked, or a government website was hacked, or whatever. But the hacker mentality is actually really productive and helpful, especially in the time that we live in right now, because hacking, in its original context, is not necessarily like doing something bad, but just repurposing things in ways that they weren't originally intended to do. And so hacking can be applied to architecture, government, public space. And I would highly recommend to you Paul Graham's 2003 essay, Hackers and Painters, for a little bit more on this idea, which I don't have time to fully flesh out right now. But getting back to this idea of our relationship to space and communication and presence, I became, around the time of grad school, and a little bit before even, keenly interested in the technology of GPS, right? This is series of satellites launched by the US government in the 1990s, and it's the kind of thing that, we don't even know where we are anymore if we didn't have this, right? That little blue dot on our screens is like ontologically meaningful for us. So specifically, I was interested in not just the technology of GPS, but the underlying infrastructure behind it. This is what GPS actually looks like if you go under the hood, so to speak. This is called NMEA data, and it includes information about your current speed. It includes information about the direction that you're heading in. It includes information about the time, and of course it includes information using Cartesian coordinates that actually allow you to locate yourself. But the interesting thing about this data is that it's constantly changing. So if you look at a stream of GPS data as it's received from those satellites that are whirling overhead all the time, you realize that there is a significant degree of instability in this information. Right? That means that those numbers, which appear so steadily on your screen, are actually constantly adjusting and sort of working around to approximate one's location, usually with an accuracy of about 3 meters, depending on where you are, whether you're indoors or outdoors. And so I was interested in that inaccuracy of the technology that we use so often to try to locate ourselves. And I created a piece called Locative Planes, which is currently installed at the Green Gallery, so when we have our reception later today, you can go take a look at this. But this one, here's the problem with new media art, is so often it requires 2 forms of explanation, right? People are like, why did you do that? and then people are also like, how did you do that? So let me give you a little bit of context for this piece, so when you go, you'll have a sense of what's going on. This project, Locative Planes, works by taking one live video image from the environment and then taking that image from the environment, abstracting it a bit, and then mapping the image to 2 parallel rectangular planes. Then I patch live GPS data into this, and the margin of error that occurs within the GPS signal actually modulates the position of these planes. So this is a kind of live installation working both with live video data as well as the inaccuracy of this technology that we so often use to try to locate ourselves in a way that produces a kind of disorienting meditation on location, what it is to be somewhere, what does it mean to say, here I am. So I'll just let this run for a few seconds. Each technological change produces both wonder and awe. The first message sent by telegraph in May of 1844 is this: "What hath God wrought?" The selection of this passage from the book of Numbers points to a spiritually charged cultural response to telegraphy. And if you consider this a question, I would say that we are still in the midst of asking similar questions about digital media today. Paul Graham, in that essay that I referred to earlier, Hackers and Painters, suggests that the most interesting work of new technological developments usually occurs within the first 2 generations of its invention, right? We still consider Renaissance painting to be some of the greatest examples of painting, right? Leonardo and his cadre, that's the kind of time that we always refer back to as the golden era of painting. And you know what? We're still figuring out what it is for the physical and the digital to coexist. Meanwhile, the conditions of networked media have already entered our daily lives. So it's not even a question anymore for me about why do you use digital media in your practice. It would be like me saying, why do you use email? Something like that, right? This is so embedded in the way that we work these days that to gather this digital material, not exclusively, but as an aspect of our practice, only makes sense. So let me end just by asking to you, then, how will you embrace the expressive potential of computational media? Thank you.
Hello. Well, I definitely feel like the odd woman out in this conference. My background is books, and when I say books, I mean this kind of book, the kind you can smell and run your hands through and turn the pages. I don't own a Kindle or a Nook or anything like that, and as much time as I have to spend reading on the screen, I still read books. As a matter of fact, I mean, my whole life has been centered on books. It's the subject of the book out there that I have, my first book, Booked Literature in the Soul of Me, about growing up in love with books and being shaped by books and finding God in books when I couldn't find him in my little country Baptist Sunday school and church or in youth group. Does anyone find God in youth group? I don't know, but I found him in books. And so, and for a long time, my faith journey, actually my whole faith journey, is wrapped up in books, and in the sense as I was growing up and reading voraciously and reading promiscuously, as John Milton put it in the 17th century. I felt like my relationship with books was by definition at odds with my relationship with God, and so my whole journey to God and in loving him more with my heart, soul, and mind happened through books and learning that I can love God and love books too, because he is the Word. And so I did take that love of books into my college career and then eventually into PhD studies, getting my PhD in English and continuing to read books and then to teach about books. As a matter of fact, I was finishing up my PhD when I first began to email. I can remember the dial-up sounds that many of you probably don't. And I remember one of the professors in my last graduate seminar requiring the class to get on a listserv and email one another questions and discussion, and I was so distressed about that. I mean, I really had a lot of anxiety about it. I didn't have email at home. I had to go to campus to do this. And a few years later, when I was emailing that professor, he reminded me of that, because I am, despite my conflicted relationship with digital technology, I am quite a voracious and promiscuous emailer and tweeter and Facebooker and so forth, and I'll get into that. And by the way, just to clarify, when I use the word promiscuous, I use it in its etymological sense, which means indiscriminate mixing, and can be applied to a lot of things, including reading and tweeting. So some people get a little concerned when I use that word. All right, so there I was. I graduated with my PhD, took my first teaching job, which is still my teaching job, at Liberty University, teaching English. Was just learning how to email and just learning about, I think it was after that I learned about Google. And when I arrived at Liberty, I remember encountering some professors who thought that they were just all the rage because they were using this thing called PowerPoint. And I never understood PowerPoint, and I still don't understand PowerPoint. But that is really when I started to begin thinking about form and content, and I understand PowerPoint when you want to put up a picture, that makes sense, but I didn't understand using it when you were actually talking about words, and you could read the words in front of you and so forth. So my relationship to technology has always been skeptical, cynical, questioning, and then and conflicted. So it's a very, very strange thing, I have to confess, to live in the time when the very thing that you have centered your whole life on and has been the center of Western civilization for centuries and centuries seems to be passing away. It's disorienting, it's scary, it's sad. It feels a little bit like I'm leaving home or my home is leaving me. I don't allow my students to use ebooks. They have to bring the textbooks to class. I all but prohibit the use of laptops in class, and I require my students there are exceptions, but I encourage them very strongly to take their notes by hand and write notes. I can't see because of the lights, but I'm sure some of you are just really utterly shocked and amazed, but and disoriented yourselves, this old-fashioned approach. I required them to take their notes by hand and so forth. So it is disorienting. But on the other hand, I feel not only not at home, but I have to confess to also being at home in some elements of the digital media. I want to read to you from my handwritten notes a very important passage that I have to keep in mind in my love affair with books and the written word. These words come from long, long ago from Plato, the Phaedrus. And in the Phaedrus, Socrates records a character saying this. It's not too long, but bear with me. This is very important, I think, not only for our discussion here, but especially in how I navigate this disorientation of transitioning from print culture to digital culture. This is one character in Phaedrus speaking. He's just heard about this new technology, and he's very concerned. To one, it is given to create the things of art, and to another to judge what amount of harm, what measure of harm and of profit they have for those who shall employ them. And so it is that you, by reasons of your tenderness for the writing that is your offspring, have declared the very opposite of its true effect. If men learn this, meaning writing, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling this remembrance, calling forth from remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. What you have discovered is a recipe not for memory, but for reminder. And this is no true wisdom that you offer your disciples, but only its semblance. For by telling them of many things without teaching them, you will make them seem to know. Much, while for the most part they know nothing. And as men filled not with wisdom, but with the conceit of wisdom, they will be a burden to their fellows. So I want to take those words and think about how this applies to digital media and the internet and technology, but in fact they apply to writing, to the written word, and then eventually to books, because writing is a technology. Books, the printing of books comes through technology. And that's something that I have to wrestle with and realize that the same digital revolution that we're going through now is very, very similar to the print revolution that took place in the 18th century, which is actually my period of specialty. I'll be talking about this more in my workshop this afternoon in talking about my other book, which is about an 18th century writer and reformer and how she used print technology as a Christian, as an evangelical Christian, to effect change in the world. So when I think about Plato's cautions about the technology of writing and the revolution that it would transform in people and in culture, and I think about how much I love writing and how much I value it, I have to remember that the digital revolution is a similar revolution in technology, and it brings with it potential for bad, and it's not something, it just is, and it's how we use it that matters. So I did, I've mentioned already that my own journey with my own digital journey has been a conflicted one. So much as I love books, I also, I have gotten into technology some. I was probably one of the first among my colleagues to get on Facebook when it came out. And I did it because I wanted to, I wanted to spy on my students. It was a little strange to me, and I wanted to see what they were doing with this thing called Facebook. And I immediately began to use Facebook as a classroom. Way back when it began, it was only people who had an EDU address in their email who could use it. It was really just for college communities. And so it was simpler then. And so I began using it as an extension of my classroom, as a great place to post articles, to continue discussion. And to this day, even though like my aunts and my cousins and my next door neighbors and all these other people are on Facebook, and it's gotten much more complicated, I still primarily use it as a classroom. And I often get comments from people about the kinds of constructive discussions that I have on Facebook by posting an article and having discussion with people, believers, non-believers, and different topics, sometimes political topics, often literary and artistic topics. And so, and it's also, it's words, right? It is that great funny line from Dane at the beginning about, here's this brick and we use it to watch cat videos and to argue with people. Well, there can be some argument and discussion that's very, very constructive. I get a lot of messages from people, private messages, thanking me for the kinds of constructive discussions and debates that I am able to host on Facebook. And so then it wasn't long before I began that I got a Twitter account, and that took me a while to get my handle around, to get a handle on, but. Now Twitter I use in the same way to post not only my own work but other work, and I get a lot of messages from people who, just one the other day asked me what I do for a living because I post such great content. But again, it goes back, I'm trying to merge my relationship with the written word and with ideas and discourse on Twitter, and it works very well because Twitter is great for sharing ideas in written form. And as a result of all of this digitization, I really have to attribute to that my own success as a writer, as an author of a couple of books, because when I went into academia and began teaching, I really did not have in mind writing books or writing for Christianity Today or writing for The Atlantic. I just simply wanted to teach, and I wanted to write my academic articles in my peer-reviewed journals and disappear from the face of the earth other than that and live in the ivory tower. That's still very attractive to me. But as a result of this digital media and the kind of networking and relationships that form over those things, the few little articles that I had written in old-fashioned print magazines got read by some editors, and I often have aspiring writers ask me how I got started in writing for these kinds of publications, and it's not to say that my story is the same as anyone else's, but literally editors contacted me and asked me to write for them. Because they had read other things that I wrote. And this connects, I think, to some things we're going to be talking about later this afternoon, this fear of there being an overabundance of so much stuff out there. I do believe that things can emerge, and that hard work and quality can pay off and can bring attention to itself. And so as a result of the digital world, and the possibilities that it makes, but also as a result of just putting in the 10,000 hours and writing for little obscure places, the two things merged, and that really is how I've been able to write as much as I write out on the internet. And I am a promiscuous writer as well. I post a lot, and so and write a lot, and that's all been because of this digital world. So, and even the book publications really came about because of that. And again, it's a mixture. And I can't see the clock, so I'm not sure how much time I have. Okay, thanks. And again, it's a great mixture to me, because my first book contract, when I was really an unknown and had not published much at all, came as a result of old-fashioned personal relationship and digital networking. Literally, it was a woman in my church who introduced me to a publisher, and I got my first book contract. But she had that relationship with that publisher through the blogosphere, through the internet. So it really, really was both. And I had tried for years to get a publisher this was the old-fashioned way when no one was on the internet and you couldn't email or phone people personally. And so now, as anyone who's on the internet knows, you can tweet to some big publisher or you can connect and so forth. And my second book came as a result of me sending a Facebook message to a famous author and asking him to come and speak at our school, and he did, and then that relationship formed and he got me my second book contract. So it really is this nice meshing of the old-fashioned written word, human relationships, and this wonderful tool, this scary tool, this powerful tool known as the internet and digital culture. So I am feeling more at home there as I mesh sort of uneasily these two worlds. But of course, as evangelicals, as Christians, the questions are even bigger. I mean, really, none of this is our home, yet we are here and we are to make it at least our temporary home. So just as Plato had these great fears about this new technology of writing and how it would change human culture and human thinking and human behavior, those fears were right. But I think that the gifts that writing bestowed on the world are far greater than the losses. And I think the same is true of this digital revolution. Even for those of us who approach it with fear and trembling, I am greatly the beneficiary of it, and I am doing my best to use it as a tool to engage the culture and to disciple as many as I can reach. Thank you.
How are you doing? Awesome. My name is Stephen Proctor, Nashville, and I want to talk to you today about visual worship. What is visual worship? Well, let me just kind of start with a little bit of a history lesson here. Just really slight, kind of a broad, overarching narrative arc of what's been happening in the church. And I am gonna kind of shift gears out of like internet and kind of the digitization of culture in general, and I'm gonna bring it down. I'm gonna focus down into the worship service. How does all this conversation, how does it relate to what in the world we're doing with all of our productions and with leading worship and the spaces that we're creating when we gather on Sundays or midweek for nights of worship or Bible studies or whatnot? So the arc is like, we've, in the past 50 years, 100 years, whatever, however long, we've kind of shifted from like, singing lots of hymns, and then we kind of transitioned in the 80s to like choruses, the Vineyard movement and all these things happened, and all these songs are coming out, and we're singing these choruses, and then we've kind of transitioned into this, what we call sometimes on the internet, the modern worship movement, where there's, we're singing all the different songs that Passion and Jesus Culture and Hillsong, and the list goes on. I'm from Nashville, where most of those songs seem to be written. There's a parallel narrative of what's been happening with visuals and technology. And it's that we've transitioned from hymnals to using PowerPoint, much to Karen's detriment. And I loved what you shared. That was amazing. And then transitioning into like motion backgrounds and, this is kind of esoteric for some people. Like I'm talking about the PowerPoint guy in the back, right? And the software that we use, because so much of the visuals that we're introducing into our worship spaces is happening through the screens. All of our eyes are constantly looking at the screens or looking at something. So that's what I want to address. There's all these motion backgrounds and presentation software that's been happening. When people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them that it's kind of like PowerPoint on steroids. For the last 12 years, I've made a career out of running the slides. And during this time, I evolved from being the PowerPoint guy into what I like to call a visual worship leader, a curator of images who arranges beauty in time and space in order to create an environment and tell a story. Projection is my paintbrush, and the screen is my canvas. In the last decade, production technology has progressed like we've never imagined, and it's found a home in many of our churches. Despite the fact that most art and imagery were excommunicated because of the Protestant Reformation, since the modern worship movement came into being, evangelicals have become fascinated, if not a little obsessed, with the use of technology in worship, particularly in the area of projection. Of course, I'm biased. I'd like to thank those Protestant reformers for throwing out all that art and imagery, because now I have a really fun job. Evangelical churches have been using projection and visual media for a myriad of reasons, mainly to make the worship service more exciting and attractive, and my favorite one, relevant. These words always make me twitch a little. Our big productions have now serve as visual amplifiers. It's all been fun to be a part of, but after a dozen years, my soul has become weary. My eyes are tired. The noise has just become too much. And while I'm all about raucous celebration, I believe we have lost the art of reverent reflection. We have very little sense of sacred space, and very rarely do I find a worship environment that slows you down and stirs up a prophetic imagination. The art of sacred space isn't just about creating a nice aesthetic, although that's always nice. Like, have y'all seen the wood palettes and the Edison light bulbs hanging everywhere? Raise your hand if you've seen that. It's kind of a popular trend right now. And it's nice. I mean, it's wood, it's natural, it's timeless. Edison bulbs, kind of back to the basics of the dawn of electricity. I don't know, I kind of relate, and it's such a tangent, and this is so dangerous for me. It's like we love single origin coffee. I'm obsessed with coffee, but single origin coffee, and we're kind of getting back to the basics and get away from the mass production of everything. It's I almost see that happening in churches where we're getting back to the basics. Let's get back to our roots, the ancient roots. You always hear people, let's get back to the early church. We even do that with our technology. It's Edison light bulbs, vinyl record players. Even when Instagram started, it was sharing your photos to make it look like it's analog to create some kind of nostalgic feeling. Anyways, I digress. The art of sacred space isn't just about creating a nice aesthetic, although that's always nice. But we need to tell a story, a visual liturgy, if you will. We have a verbal liturgy for our ears and voices, but what about a visual liturgy for our eyes? I believe our bodies are sacramental. And if this is true, how are we forming ourselves through what we see? And if we are feeding the eyes of our community, no matter what who your audience is, whether it's a congregation or your Twitter followers or Instagrammers or a gallery, shouldn't we serve more than eye candy as the main course? Unfortunately, modern worship has borrowed the liturgy of the rock concert, which forms worshipers into fans and critics. When the worship leader and the object of our worship occupy the same visual space, the worshiper gets easily confused, consciously or subconsciously, about who the sinner truly is. And I know that sounds crazy because it's my heart doesn't want to worship the worship leaders, but our space says that we do. By default, the posture of entertainment encourages consumerism instead of consecration. In a sense, we never got away from the use of icons and images. We just substituted the art for the celebrity. As Lisa Gungor wrote in her song Shiny Buildings, art and architecture purposed all to point to something else, slowly turning into stages where we're pointing to ourselves. We need icons, not idols. We've traded the mill for the microphone, and we've lost the stage and we've lost the sacrament and gained the stage. No wonder our houses of worship are starting to feel more like a showroom in a concert hall than instead of a sanctuary. The environment you meet in will, over time, shape the way you worship. Or as Frank Lloyd Wright says, we shape our environment, and then our environment shapes us. We desperately need a stronger, healthier visual liturgy, from our media to stage design to lighting to the entire posture of the room. We need to embrace a Christ-centered visual language of beauty and space. Our visuals need to line up with our verbals. And we've seen this practiced historically through the building of cathedrals, but hardly anyone is doing that these days, especially not in the evangelical world. To paraphrase one of my favorite people in the world, Ian Cron, in his book, Chasing Francis, he said, "Medievals built huge ornate churches so that people walking into them would feel like they've left one world and entered another reality, the kingdom of God. Think of what happens when you walk in those doors. Think what happens to your senses. Stained glass windows, frescoes and paintings, dimmed lights, flickering candles, the smell of incense, vaults and arches pulling your spirit upwards, and angels soaring on the ceilings. God sneaks up on you through the architecture." St. Augustine said that the human mind was particularly delighted when truth was presented to it indirectly, like in symbols in sacred space. Unfortunately, most churches today are designed without any sense of the iconic because moderns like straightforward communication. We want worship centers where hominess is more important than holiness. It seems that most church architecture today focuses on the utilitarian more than anything else. We want our architects to load us up with all the technological goodies that you'd find in a world-class performing arts center. But what we've ended up asking for is lights, camera, action, rather than Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Everything speaks. Everything. Not just what comes through this microphone and those speakers, or what you find in the text in your Bible or the hymnal or whatever the PowerPoint is. Like, the entire space sends a message and creates a posture. Now, I don't think every church needs to go build some big ornate cathedral, even though that would be kind of cool if we got back into that. But how can we reclaim a sense of sacred space where we currently gather? And here's where we really kind of focus in. How can we use technology and art in subtle yet immersive ways that bring back a sense of awe and wonder, like the cathedrals of old? At my church, we have a saying, creativity must be the subtle amplification of our worship. Subtlety is key. Immersive environments should slow you down and stir up your imagination, not create more noise. There's nothing wrong with production technology, just only how you use it. But from what I've seen in the past few years, and I've seen a lot, the good, bad, and the ugly, the popular way production is used these days, I don't feel is the healthiest. We need to recalibrate the layout of our worship services from the stage back to the table. This one parishioner in New York summed it up really nicely, and this is what I'm talking about. This is my aim when trying to create a worship experience. The service felt sacred. It drew me in. It didn't feel like a rock concert or a pep rally. It made me quiet my soul and then allowed me to engage the presence of God. Technology has given us the power to turn the spotlight onto ourselves, but perhaps there's a better, more interesting way. And for the last 12 years, I've been trying to experiment with art, liturgy, and technology. And one of the methods I've discovered is what we in the church like to call environmental projection. Let me just show you a couple of examples. Here's just a basic big mega church in Texas, of course, because everything's bigger in Texas. And if we can dim the lights down, that'd be great too. And with these projectors, I can just simply flip a switch and transform the entire space. We can go into a city if we want to, or declare the names of God during worship. One of my favorite things to do while we're singing the name of God over and over again, Jesus, Jesus, or whatever the bridge is like, let's just wrap the room in who he is and what his name is. This isn't just for big rooms, but you can do this in small spaces as well, as you're seeing here in the room. I've set some projectors up so we can enjoy that today. Here's a small room that was curated for about 12 people for a prayer service. Here's another standard Baptist church. Again, like I walk into a space and see white walls. I'm like, yes, perfect. Blank canvas. And through a process of perfecting the projected image and lining up to the seams of the projection, we can transform it into a cathedral. Here's another example where there's acoustic tiles and paneling on the back wall. And using 3 projectors and the standard software that most churches are using today, you can do this. And it's actually quite relatively inexpensive. I mean, each one of these projectors on stage is about $1,500. I'm using a $300 box that spans it across multiple projectors, a laptop, and a $400 software. Of course, there's the art, and that's priceless. I couldn't help myself. I'm gonna play a clip from Finding Neverland. Have anyone seen that movie with Johnny Depp? I mean, it's incredible. Hey Max, if you can go ahead and fade that music out or just pause iTunes. That way it's not overlapping. And there's audio with that too. Yeah.
I'm an old man, and I've seen few of the sights.
Environmental projection closes the gap between reality and our imagination. I can really make it rain in the room if I want to. I feel like Mr. Barry sometimes, like peeking in from behind the curtain, looking at the worship service, seeing tired old men and women who sometimes are very young, but their soul is tired, just nodding off. Even with all the exciting songs we sing and the flickering, blinking lights, you're just nodding off. And it's like, how can we engage the imagination? What if we bring a prophetic imagination into the picture? What then? And perhaps we have an opportunity to create experiences where we aren't just simply fantasizing and escaping into a false reality, but rather waking the soul up to a truer reality, the kingdom of God, and all of its beauty, both the beauty of creation and the beauty of our Creator. Though I strongly believe we in the church are continuing to wrestle with this use of technology and media in the liturgical space, I am very encouraged and I have hope. Like the illuminators and stained glass artists of old, there is a generation of production artists, prophets, priests that are rising up to recover the practice of sacred space, to bring back a theology for our eyes, to illuminate the blank and barren worship spaces, to recalibrate the big productions so that they shine a light on the beauty of the word and sacraments. And as Dane quoted our friend Jeremy earlier, to help the church learn to see rather than trying to be seen. And by doing so in a way that keeps Christ, not our creativity, at the center of our visual worship. Thank you. Now, we're gonna transition in just to a time where we can sit and kind of soak this in. It's kind of been a fire hose of information and everything. And we're gonna put this into practice a little bit. And we're gonna take the next 10 to 12 minutes and before we go into our break, and we're going to have a time of worship, but it's going to be a different type of worship. We're going to worship through our eyes and with our imaginations, and it's going to be very meditative and reflective, so I just encourage you to just turn all the devices off, uncross your legs, and just be present and be here for the next 10 minutes, and just take in beauty and let your imagination just be. So.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.